Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before the story pulls you in too deep. Some stories are not written in books, nor told in whispers. They exist like stains, buried beneath the floors of history, impossible to wash out. You don't stumble across them in classrooms or libraries. You find them where silence weighs heavier than words, where elders turn their heads when asked, and where truth feels like trespassing. Tonight, I want to bring you into one of those shadows. They say every family carries a secret, but what happens when a secret isn't simply shameful? It's monstrous. What happens when pleasure, power, and perversion intertwine, leaving behind a tale so sickening that even time itself tries to bury it? This is the story of a man who sold his own mother for pleasure. It begins in the late 19th century, in a forgotten village that no longer appears on most maps. The census records call it Ashfield, but locals whispered another name, the Hollow, a place where morality seemed to wither, where the church bells rang but no one listened, and where families carried lineages too twisted to trace. The man at the center of this story was not remarkable in appearance. He was described in court records as thin, with uneven eyes and a strange smile that never reached his face. What set him apart was not his looks, but the appetite that consumed him. He wasn't content with the ordinary sins of his neighbors, gambling, drinking, petty theft. His hunger was darker, crawling from a place no one dared speak of. The first hints came when neighbors noticed his mother, an aging woman, frail but stern, suddenly isolated. She no longer attended Sunday services. Her curtains stayed drawn. Some said she was ill. Others claimed she had grown paranoid. Yet those who lived close enough swore they heard arguments late into the night, followed by laughter that chilled the blood. One winter, her name appeared in the ledger of debts, not under her own hand, but his. He had mortgaged their land, bartered away heirlooms, and whispered transactions in the back of taverns. Then came the unthinkable, a deal made not with coin or goods, but with flesh and blood. A son offering his own mother, reduced to currency in a bargain that defies human understanding. The Hollow never forgave him, but they also never spoke of it, and so the story rotted underground, until now. The records that remain are fragmented, like torn pages scattered by the wind, yet, when pieced together, they reveal something deeply unsettling. This man, whose name I will not repeat, for it carries curses in old tongues, was both feared and pitied. Villagers said he was born strange, a child who did not cry, but hissed, a boy who preferred shadows to sunlight. His mother, a widow by the time he reached adolescence, clung to him as her only remaining kin. That bond, instead of growing into loyalty, curdled into something grotesque. The Hollow was not a place where wealth flowed. Families survived on barter and the exchange of what little they had. And yet, whispers claim this man discovered something different, a form of trade that reached beyond the material. One drunken evening, inside the smoke-filled tavern at the edge of town, he made his proposal. To the men gathered there, he offered his mother, not for marriage, not for labor, but for their own gratification, a son reducing his own blood to a currency of flesh. The tavern keeper, who later confessed in a hushed statement, said the men laughed at first, thinking it was a cruel joke, but the son did not laugh. His face remained still, his crooked smile cutting deep deeper than the silence. The laughter soon faded. Men who had lost wives, men who hungered for power, men who thrived on cruelty. They listened, and in that dimly lit room, a pact was sealed. His mother's protests were said to echo through the night. Some neighbors swore they heard her screams carried on the winter wind, but no one intervened. Fear, shame, and complicity bound the villagers tighter than any rope. By the time morning came, she appeared with bruises hidden beneath her shawl, and eyes that no longer met anyone else's. Her dignity had been stripped, traded like coins, passed across a table. But here lies the question that haunts historians. Did she ever forgive him? Some suggest she protected him still, refusing to name her son even when chance arose. Others believe her silence was not forgiveness, but paralysis, the crushing weight of humiliation. The truth is lost, but one thing is certain. Her suffering was not a secret. It was known, seen, heard, and yet it was swallowed by the ground itself, as though the hollow had agreed to bury her alongside its own decaying soul. What followed was not a single act, but a pattern, a ritual of degradation that stretched over months. The hollow, small and insular, became complicit through silence. Every soul who looked away, every neighbor who shut their windows at night, became a thread in the web that allowed the horror to grow. In history, we often ask how atrocities on a grand scale are permitted. Yet here, in this tiny forgotten place, we see the answer in miniature. Fear, greed, and the quiet convenience of doing nothing. There were attempts, scattered and half-hearted, to intervene. A local priest, young and new to the parish, visited the house after hearing rumors. He returned pale, his sermons afterward filled with trembling warnings of sin that seemed aimed at something more immediate than abstract vice. Within weeks he requested a transfer, leaving behind only a cryptic note. The son has swallowed the role of the father, and the mother is a lamb among wolves. That note was never read aloud in church, but folded away in parish archives, where I first discovered it. Meanwhile, the son's appetite deepened. He was no longer content with simple transactions. Witness accounts suggest he began boasting that power came not from money, nor from title, but from owning the shame of another human being. And who could be owned more completely, he claimed, than the one who gave you life? His words, preserved in scattered recollections, chill the blood even now. His mother, once known in the hollow as a woman of stern dignity, grew gaunt and silent. Neighbors noted her walks became shorter, her gaze always cast to the ground. Yet strangely, some accounts describe her as defiant, not broken, standing in doorways with a stillness that unnerved those who had partaken in her suffering, as though she bore witness to her own destruction, refusing to vanish into invisibility. That, perhaps, was her final resistance. But here lies another mystery. Court papers years later mention a ledger kept by the son, filled with names and dates, evidence that this was not simply one crime, but dozens, recorded as though in mockery of bookkeeping. That ledger, however, was never presented in court. It vanished, either destroyed by the villagers who feared its exposure, or hidden by those who wished to protect the family name. Its absence leaves a void that history cannot fill. Time is cruel, but memory can be crueler still. As the years turned, the villagers of the hollow learned to live with the stain among them. Some convinced themselves it was not their burden to bear. Others claimed it was God's punishment on a woman for sins they could not name. But the truth was darker. It was easier to demonize her than confront what her son had done. To acknowledge her suffering was to confront their own cowardice, and so they buried her alive in silence. But silence has cracks, and through those cracks, fragments of truth escaped. In 1897, a traveling journalist, known for prying into scandals, passed through the hollow. His notes, discovered decades later in a private collection, speak of a house where sorrow is currency, and a mother whose soul had been mortgaged by her own blood. The villagers tried to dissuade him, offering food, lodging, anything to push him away. Yet he returned, again and again, sketching the crooked streets and the house with curtains always drawn. Then, suddenly, his writings stop. His journal ends mid-sentence, the ink trailing off like breath cut short. He was never heard from again. The son, meanwhile, had grown bolder. He began to spend freely, appearing in nearby towns with coin, jewelry, and livestock that could not be traced to his modest farm. Rumors followed him like shadows. In taverns, miles away, men whispered of the hollow's strange son, who sold what should never be sold, who laughed at the line between sin and crime. Yet whenever officials tried to investigate, they were met with silence. Witnesses vanished, evidence was burned, and the hollow seemed to close its doors against the outside world. The mother lingered on, but she was no longer the woman people once knew. In a surviving photograph, grainy, almost spectral, she stares past the camera, her face sunken, her shawl pulled tightly around her. Some cleat, aim. Her eyes appear doubled, as though two women were trapped inside her, one alive, one already gone. That image, once hidden in a family Bible, now circulates in whispers as a relic of shame. Why did no one intervene? Why did a whole town protect a monster while condemning his victim? Perhaps because facing him meant facing themselves. In the hollow, guilt was not individual. It was collective, and it was absolute. By the dawn of the new century, the hollow's secret was no longer contained within its borders. Strangers spoke of it in whispers, passing the tale from tavern to tavern like a poison carried in the bloodstream of rumor. The son's notoriety grew until it began to resemble legend, half fact, half nightmare. Some said he had cursed blood. Others claimed he had made a pact with forces not of this world. Yet what made the story most terrifying was not the superstition, but its cold reality. A man willing to barter the very sanctity of motherhood. It was around this time that the first official investigation was launched. Authorities from a neighboring town, spurred by a tip from an anonymous letter, arrived in the hollow one spring morning. The villagers greeted them with a hostile silence, as though the mere presence of outsiders was an act of desecration. Still, the officers pressed on, questioning neighbors, examining ledgers, and walking the creaking floors of the son's home. Their report, though heavily redacted in archives, contains one chilling line. The house breathes with a presence not its own. They found evidence, broken furniture, stains that could not be explained, a woman's garment torn beyond repair. But when they tried to question the mother directly, she spoke only in fragments. "He is my son," she repeated over and over, until her voice cracked. To every question, every accusation, she offered the same refrain. Was it loyalty? Was it fear? Or was it something deeper? A fracture in the human mind when forced to live in unbearable contradiction. The officers left without charges, and the hollow sealed itself tighter, its silence heavier than before. Years passed. The son grew older, but not weaker. His power over the hollow became almost absolute, not through wealth or position, but through the quiet terror that wrapped around every household. Families once muttered against him, now bowed their heads when he passed. Children were warned never to wander near his home, yet they were told nothing of why. Fear became a language, and he was its only fluent speaker. And still, the mother endured. Each year she seemed more spectral, her presence fading as though she were a ghost trapped in her own body. The hollow had become her tomb long before her death. Eventually, the weight of secrecy could not hold forever. It was not justice that shattered the silence of the hollow, but betrayal. One of the son's own associates, a man who had once taken part in the unspeakable transactions, grew fearful as whispers of exposure reached the larger towns. He confessed in fragments to a traveling magistrate, his words stumbling over guilt and desperation. That testimony, though vague, was enough to spark renewed investigation. The son was finally dragged before the courts, but history is rarely kind to truth, and the trial that followed was no exception. Witnesses refused to speak, neighbors claimed ignorance, and documents mysteriously disappeared. Even the parish priest's note, that chilling warning about a lamb among wolves, was dismissed as hearsay. The court wanted order, not revelation, and so the charges were narrowed, reduced to theft, fraud, and public indecency. The grotesque heart of his crimes, the selling of his mother, was brushed aside, as though society itself could not bear to put such words into official record. The mother herself was brought to testify. A frail, nearly voiceless woman by then, she sat hunched in the wooden witness chair, her shawl pulled tightly around her. When asked if her son had harmed her, she whispered, "He is my son." When pressed again, she repeated it, and again. It was all she would say, as though that phrase had become both shield and chain. The courtroom, filled with spectators hungry for scandal, fell into an uneasy silence. Her words silenced the law itself. The verdict was almost anticlimactic. The son was sentenced to a few short years for fraud, his darkest crimes erased from the official narrative. He walked free before long, returning to the hollow with the arrogance of a man who had not only evaded justice, but bent it to his will. To the villagers, his freedom was proof of something unholy, whether the power of corruption or the silence of a god who had abandoned them. And so, the hollow sank deeper into its pact of silence. The mother continued her slow decline, while the son thrived in shadows. History rarely documents what happened in those final years, but fragments suggest the hollow itself began to rot, families fleeing, buildings collapsing, as though the land itself sought to erase the memory of what had been allowed. The story does not end neatly, because horrors rarely do. The son lived out his remaining years in the hollow, though by then it was less a village than a skeleton of its former self. Houses stood abandoned, weeds broke through cobblestones, and only a handful of families remained. Families bound by silence, shame, and the memory of a crime too unspeakable to carry into the new century. He walked those empty streets as if he owned them, his uneven smile unnerving those who still dared to glance his way. The mother died quietly, her passing unrecorded in official ledgers. No marked grave exists. Some say she was buried at the edge of the churchyard. Others claim she was laid in the field behind their house, her resting place chosen to avoid scandal. Wherever she lies, her grave remains unmarked, a silent testimony to how thoroughly she had been erased. The hollow pretended she had never lived at all, but the son, his story refused to die with him. After his death, strange tales began to circulate. Travelers who stumbled through the hollow in the years after claimed to see a figure in the window of the old house, a frail woman staring with eyes too hollow to belong to the living. Some swore they heard arguments carried on the wind, her voice pleading, his laughter answering. Others said the house itself groaned at night, its timbers shifting as though replaying memories best left buried. When the last of the villagers left, the hollow became a ghost town. The house still stands today, though barely, a sagging structure with curtains still drawn, as if holding its breath. Few dare to approach. Photographers who have tried capture nothing but blurred images, shadows where faces should be, and rooms too dark despite daylight streaming in. Some believe the stain of what happened there can never fade, that the ground itself remembers. And so the story survives, not in official, all histories, not in textbooks or records, but in whispers. A man who bartered away his own mother for pleasure, a community that chose silence over truth, a wound that refuses to heal, echoing across generations. Perhaps that is the real horror, not just what one man did, but what others allowed him to do. And maybe, in some dark way, that's why the hollow still feels alive, because guilt never truly dies.